Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Plan, Install, Configure, and Manage Client Access. It's a primary subject for the 70-341 Exchange 2013 Core Solutions Certification Exam. The subtopic that we're discussing in this lesson is Troubleshoot Client Connectivity. Under the subject Troubleshoot Client Connectivity, this objective may include, but is not limited to, troubleshoot Outlook Anywhere connectivity, troubleshoot POP and IMAP, troubleshoot authentication, troubleshoot web services, troubleshoot auto-discover, and troubleshoot mobile devices, or more specifically, ActiveSync connections. So from a scenario perspective, we're looking at an in-home massage and facial expert company called HomeMassageFacial.com. Their problem is that they're using an on-premise exchange and they want to make sure client connectivity will not be an issue. So it's a very large organization, it's across the nation, and so they are keeping control over their own exchange environment, but they need to make sure, being that everybody's mobile, that there are no client connectivity issues, whether you're working in-house or whether you're working in the field using an Outlook web app connection or using some type of ActiveSync connection and so forth. Everything has to be working. So our goal is to review options with them to troubleshoot initial setup as well as other issues. Okay, so let's get started. In my opinion, there are two different types of troubleshooting. There's configuration troubleshooting, which could involve anything and everything. Perhaps DNS configuration, client issues. Maybe the client has the problem, and so you're looking at the server when in reality it's the client. Network connectivity, client access server configuration, and so forth. So with configuration, there's a lot of room for error. Once something is working, however, if it stops working, this involves a completely different type of troubleshooting. And so in those cases, it's helpful if you have a monitoring solution in place to help. You know, it's interesting that we've discussed other portions of Exchange in this series, like the mailbox server role or transport services, and they typically include both monitoring and troubleshooting. But in this case, we're revolving mostly around troubleshooting. And I think the main reason for this is that the focus with the client access server is on the first portion here, the configuration, the initial configuration trouble that folks seem to have. So we're going to spend a good deal of time on that. It's safe to assume if something goes wrong after it was working, especially with the client access server role, it means something's down. The client access server's down, the network is down, maybe services are down, or it might mean someone changed something and that went badly. But in those cases, you know what was changed, hopefully, so then you should know how to fix it and put it back to what you had when things were working. You know, it's always been the case from the very start of using client access servers back with 2007 and then with 2010, there was this misconception on the part of administrators that the more difficult part of planning, designing, and deploying Exchange revolved around the mailbox server role, or around storage, or around high availability of that role. Well, in actuality, from my perspective, client access was significantly more complex, and it took a lot more careful planning. It took a good understanding of things like load balancing, of networking, certificates, DNS configuration, and so forth. It's always been a more problematic role to implement. And it seems to be that the Exchange team also recognizes the difficulty of setting up the client access role, and so they've provided a great tool that will help us when it comes to working with client access called the Remote Connectivity Analyzer. The Remote Connectivity Analyzer can be located here through this link, although you can just do a search online through Google or Bing or whatever and type in Remote Connectivity Analyzer. Basically, it's a web-based tool that's designed to help IT administrators troubleshoot connectivity issues with their Exchange deployments. It simulates different client logon and mailflow scenarios. And when a test fails, as is often the case, sometimes partially failing, the robust report that comes back can be very, very helpful. Let's jump over to a browser running the Remote Connectivity Analyzer And let's do a very simple test using the peter@trainsignal.com email that I personally use for working with TrainSignal. Now we're going to use the trainsignal.com email address because we're looking to use a production-oriented solution. Keep in mind, however, this is a hosted Exchange solution, so we're not handling the servers in-house on our own, and so as a result, the test will come back with certain failure points, even though ultimately my email is working just fine. But that's a good thing because we want you to see what happens when these tests come back with both positive and negative results intermixed. Alright, and so here you can see we have the Remote Connectivity Analyzer. Under Exchange Server, we have Microsoft Exchange ActiveSync connectivity tests. We have Microsoft Exchange Web Services connectivity tests. We have Microsoft Office Outlook connectivity tests, which include Outlook Anywhere and Outlook Auto Discover. And then we have Internet email tests for inbound and outbound SMTP. In addition, we have Lync, OCS server tests, Office 365 tests. We have a Client tab for the Microsoft Connectivity Analyzer tool. And here, if we are having difficulties when it comes to connecting with Outlook, Lync, Office 365, we can install this tool to assist us in finding out what the problem is. There's also a Microsoft Lync Connectivity Analyzer tool. And then we have a Message Analyzer here, which is currently in beta, but at the time of your viewing, this may be out of beta. In fact, by the time you view this tool, there may be additional tabs up here. And so that just goes to show you that the Microsoft Exchange team is constantly looking to improve the tools that they've provided us. And we can see from the very first version of Remote Connectivity Analyzer to this current version that they've included all of this additional testing content. So that's really fantastic in terms of being able to help us when it comes to troubleshooting. Now, if we go back to Exchange Server, obviously you can see how this tool is something that is truly valuable when it comes to troubleshooting client connectivity. And perhaps you'll see it on a certification exam, but more importantly, for a production real-world environment, you need to know that this tool exists and you need to know how to work with it. So depending on what you're looking to test, there will be different questions and options that come your way. In our case, let's just test something simple. Let's test Exchange ActiveSync. And so here, if we just click Next. Alright, so here we can use Auto Discover to detect server settings. We provide an email address. It asks for a domain and username. I can also use the UPN and my password. I can synchronize all items in the inbox folder, ignore trust for SSL. I have to indicate that I must use the credentials of a working account. If I have not verified already, it will ask me to verify the fact that I'm human. And so basically under verification, there's a code that you have to type in to verify that. Once you have that information in, you click Perform Test. And as you can see, the test failed. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't we want to see a positive result? Well, there's no fun in that. If it was always positive, then how would we learn to troubleshoot? So the nice thing about this tool is that it doesn't just tell us that something failed. If we click the little expander here, we can see where it failed. And here you can see that mostly this passed, so everything was working pretty good. What happened down here? It says an ActiveSync session is being attempted with the server. And then if we look at the test steps, it says attempting to send options. This worked out okay. But then attempting the folder sync command on the Exchange Sync session, this failed. We can get additional details here. And we see that the request was aborted. The request was canceled. Now what I know that you don't know is that actually attempting to connect up with the ActiveSync connection here put my account into a quarantine mode on the server. And so this is why this is failing right here. But the nice thing to look at here is that all of these things did pass, but there were pieces to these different tests that did not pass. If we expand all, you can see that not everything passed. So as we scroll down here, you can see that there were different pieces that did not pass, and yet it still passed the overall tests as we look at the different test steps. So it's good to be able to see where things failed and then look to see if there are things that need to be corrected in your environment. Ultimately, in this case, because the account itself is quarantined, it won't pass this test. But I can have the administrator take my account out of quarantine, and then it would pass this test. Don't believe me? Well, I'll prove it. We'll run the test again. And here you can see the test was successful this time. So this is just one test. We can look at the other tests. We can click Start Over. We can choose one of these other tests that we can perform to get more information about our system. But this is really the key tool to client connectivity troubleshooting. So it's important for you to remember that. Now, sometimes the real problem is that we don't have a full understanding of client access. Maybe there are misconceptions, misconfigurations, and so forth. So let's jump back over to our slides, and so let's revisit some of the basics regarding client access to help us when it comes to thinking about troubleshooting. So let's talk a little bit about misunderstandings that occur with the client access server role. What exactly does the CAS server do? Well, remember, it brokers all client communication, including public folder and unified messaging, by either proxying or redirecting that connection. So when we say all client communications, we're talking about Outlook Web App, IMAP, and POP connectivity, Exchange ActiveSync, Outlook Anywhere. So really that comes down to the next question, which is what services are provided through CAS? And so there are a lot of services. There's Remote PowerShell, there's Outlook Web App, there's ActiveSync, there's the Exchange Admin Center, there's even an EAC for end users, there's the Auto Discover service, Outlook Anywhere, of course, IMAP and POP connectivity, and the Availability service. And it does other things as well. But now when we look at this, it's good to note that many things have not changed, including the web services model that we have seen implemented since Exchange 2007 and 2010. Many of the services that are performed by the client access server and have been performed since 2007 still work similarly to how it did. The web services model in client access servers forms the basis of many of the features that we see here. So there are enhancements, of course. Exchange 2013 does enhance the design by moving all client access to the CAS. MAPI connections from Outlook don't exist. All Outlook connectivity now leverages RPC over HTTP, also known as Outlook Anywhere. We have all of these different services that are here. The EAC for end users is one that we haven't really discussed, but it's very similar to legacy Exchange control panel options for end users. There's some new functionality that has been included in there, such as the ability to manage site mailboxes, manage your own account information. You can add a high-resolution photo. You can manage which groups you belong to and so forth. So that EAC for end users is really just a continuation of what end users were able to do through their Outlook Web App connections in the past that tied them back into the Exchange Control Panel, now known as the EAC. So at this point, we're looking at all of the services as a whole under that web services model. But let's take a look at some of these individually, and let's discuss some points to remember for working with them in terms of troubleshooting. So one of the points to keep in mind is that you can use the test-PowerShell connectivity commandlet to test your connection to the PowerShell virtual directory. So that's something that you can use for your remote PowerShell connections. Another point to remember is that the EAC, the Exchange Admin Center, and Outlook Web App, they go hand in hand, so you want to remember to use similar virtual directory settings. For example, with your virtual directory settings, you don't want to require a secure socket layer on Outlook Web App, but not the EAC. Since the two are integrated, and remember when we say EAC, really the virtual directory is the ECP directory. So we'll take a look at that in a moment, but again, the two are integrated. So you need to be aware that there's a combination of experience there, that if you make changes to Outlook Web App, you need to make sure that you also make similar changes to the virtual directory settings for the EAC through the ECP settings. As far as Auto Discover, keep in mind that it works differently on the LAN than it does externally. Internally, AutoDiscover will look for a service connection point, and it will look for that object in Active Directory. A service connection point, or SCP, is a special object that pretty much gives computers a method or mechanism for advertising an application or service that it's hosting. So SCP objects, these are not just used for Exchange. There are other applications that certainly use SCPs, but our concern here when it comes to Exchange is that the information that's published in the AutoDiscover SCP will give Outlook the service binding information of the servers that are hosting the AutoDiscover service, which is ultimately the client access servers. Now, if the client cannot contact the Active Directory domain, for example, if it's an external client, then external AutoDiscover uses one of two URLs to connect, both looking for the autodiscover.xml file. It uses DNS to try to locate it. And then depending on your version of Outlook, it will also try to use a server resource record, an SRV record, for AutoDiscover. So that's pretty much how AutoDiscover is different internally as opposed to externally. Internally, it tries to use Active Directory. Externally, it uses DNS. Next up is Outlook Anywhere, and when it comes to Outlook Anywhere, it's good to remember that all client connectivity is done using RPC over HTTP. MAPI or RPC connectivity is gone. All client connectivity using Outlook as the client is done through RPC over HTTP. Outlook Anywhere has also been updated in 2013 to allow for two hostname settings, one for internal access and one for external access. You can configure Outlook Anywhere through the EAC or through the Exchange Management Shell, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. Clients can use AutoDiscover through Active Directory or DNS, as we mentioned just a moment ago, to locate the URLs for services, and then it responds with an XML file for those services, and the URLs are in that file. Moving on to POP and IMAP, remember something. Everyone remembers that you have to turn on POP and IMAP services. That's been the case since Exchange 2007. But remember that if you have the client access server and the mailbox server split on two separate servers, you have to enable the services on both of these servers. So you don't want to just enable it on the client access server and think, okay, we're good. You have to enable a service on the mailbox server as well. And that's because whatever protocol is used to connect to the CAS server, that's what's going to be used to connect back to the mailbox server. There are a few other changes to be aware of with regard to POP and IMAP. For example, it's not possible to use anonymous or guest accounts for security reasons. Also, administrator accounts are restricted intentionally as well. So, not much to remember there, but a couple of points on POP and IMAP. The availability service is interesting to look at for a moment. Basically, the availability service provides free busy information, and that used to be part of the public folder store for legacy Outlook. But with Exchange 2013 and this new modern public folder mailbox arrangement, clients need to use the availability service, and the information is retrieved directly from mailboxes using Exchange Web Services. The availability service, when working together with Outlook's scheduling assistant, also provides some cool features like suggested meeting times and more granular calendar sharing. So there's a benefit to using Outlook when working with the availability service. Alright, let's take a moment and jump over to our Exchange server for a moment, and let's just look at the various locations for the configuration sides to client access, because it's not necessarily all in one place, but we find the pieces of these things kind of spread out a little bit. A lot of it is located under the servers feature though, so let's take a look there. Alright, so here we are under the servers feature in the Exchange Admin Center. And here if we just take a look at the various settings, the properties of our client access server, notice that we have POP3 settings, which include things like the ports that we're going to use and whether or not we're going to use secure socket layers and the ports for that. We have IMAP settings with different ports logically. And then here we have Outlook Anywhere. And it's here actually where we configure our external host name and our internal host name for Outlook Anywhere connectivity. And depending on how you want to set this up, you might use the same or different names for these connections. You can also determine the different methods for authentication and whether or not you want to allow SSL offloading or not. So all of your settings are here for these options, but if we look back under servers, you can see we also have those virtual directories. And we've talked about these before. Here we see the ECP, which is our Exchange Admin Center. You can see the authentication there. Here's our Outlook web app, and you can see the authentication there. So again, if you make changes to the authentication of one or changes to some of these settings, you might mess up the ability for your end users to connect to the other. Here's your Auto Discover virtual directory. Exchange Web Services here. Offline Address Book, ActiveSync, PowerShell. So you can see how a lot of configuration is done through this portion under virtual directories. Then you have certificates over here. And this is also a subject that we've discussed in the past as far as how to work with certificates. So you can see a lot of your settings are here under servers, but as far as the control of these settings with regard to client connectivity and various policies, remember under permissions we have Outlook web app policies. Under mobile, we have our mobile device mailbox policies. And then, of course, under recipients, we have the ability to turn on or off various settings with regard to our end users and client connectivity and so forth, right down to enabling or disabling Outlook web app and so forth. All right, so let's jump back over to our slides, and now let's talk a little bit about the difference between proxying and redirecting when it comes to what the client access server does. All right, so I want you to understand, really not for the sake of troubleshooting per se, but just so that you get a really good grasp of what this client access server is supposed to do. I think that's, again, one of the biggest problems when it comes to troubleshooting the client access server, or client access in general, is that if you're not really sure what this role is supposed to do or how it works, then you can really get bogged down in not really understanding how it's supposed to function. So let's just try to narrow that down a little bit. Client access proxying. Here, if you have a single site, it's as easy as it gets, but it still requires a good understanding of the single site deployment here. So let's assume you have the client access server role on a separate server from the mailbox server role, and both of these are located in Florida. Now you've got a user. We'll call her Chloe. Chloe is out there using Outlook or Outlook web app. She's an end user working for the company. She's got to come in through the internet, through our firewall, and she accesses that client access server. So in this case, for Chloe to access her mailbox, when she connects up through that firewall, she goes to the client access server and it proxies her back to the mailbox server. She doesn't have to know all of that. It's just something that happens. But what happens if you have another site, let's say another Active Directory site with mailbox and client access servers? And let's say it's not an internet-facing site. In other words, Chloe can't just type in https mail.whatever.com in order to access the Outlook web app services. So how would this work in that scenario? So let's say the company has expanded, and we now have a New York office with a client access server and a mailbox server. And let's say Chloe's mailbox has actually been moved to New York. Chloe doesn't know where her mailbox is, and she really doesn't care. She uses the same connection through her browser to get back to her client access server. So what happens when she does this? Well, when using Outlook web app, the CAS server looks up Chloe's mailbox location in Active Directory, and it realizes that her mailbox is actually in New York. So at this point, the client access server in Florida will determine if there's an external URL for the CAS server in New York. In other words, it checks to see if this is an internet-facing CAS server. If it's not, then it will contact the CAS server in New York, and then it will proxy Chloe's request to it. The CAS server in New York will contact the mailbox server in New York. It gets the information for Chloe's mailbox. Then it passes that back to the client access server in Florida. And from there, that information is returned back to Chloe. So really, when we look at proxying in these two different occasions, proxying is nothing more than one client access server talking to another client access server and providing information as to how to access the user's mailbox. The client can't access the mailbox server itself, and in this case, the CAS server is not able to, in Florida, contact the mailbox server in New York, so it contacts the client access server in New York, and the CAS server does the back and forth there with the mailbox server and provides the information back. The traffic between those client access servers is done in HTTPS, not RPC. And it's important to note that when you're designing your Exchange topology, the client access servers work in what they call a point-to-point fashion between the requesting CAS and a CAS in the same site as the mailbox server. So if there were additional firewalls and so forth in place that prevented the Florida CAS from talking directly with the New York CAS, well, then this wouldn't work because the CAS is not capable of negotiating what they call a hop-to-hop route via another site where there's connectivity. So this is pretty much the way proxying works between either a single site where the CAS proxies back to the mailbox server, or when you're dealing with multiple sites where that second site is not an internet-facing site. What happens if, let's say, the second site was an internet-facing site? What would happen then? Okay, so this is where proxying is not done at this point, but redirection. And here you can see if, let's say, Chloe's mailbox was located on a mailbox server in New York, but she types in the Outlook web app address for the client access server in Florida. Well, the Florida client access server, what it would do is it would check to see if there was an internet-facing CAS where Chloe's mailbox is located. So in the previous example, there wasn't one. In this case, it is configured. And so what would happen is, instead of just proxying the whole thing for her, it would provide the information back to Chloe. So the user is then redirected to the internet-facing client access server in the site where the mailbox is in. This is very helpful because it's generally a good idea to avoid proxying. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but the user will get a better experience when connecting to a CAS in the same site as their mailbox. It also eliminates some of the strain and the stress that's put upon the WAN connection and WAN utilization when you're proxying as opposed to redirecting. From the Outlook web app perspective, this redirection comes in the form of a web page redirection. So the end user will be redirected. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this all works uniquely depending on what service you're using. For example, if you're using ActiveSync for your mobile connections, the AutoDiscover will send you to the right CAS right from the get-go. So in this case, the end user is using Outlook web app because we wanted it to be where she types in where she wants to go. And so by typing in the URL for Florida, she gets to the wrong client access server. Now maybe that's not her fault. Maybe someone should have told her that her mailbox was moved to New York. But either way, she'll be redirected where she needs to be. And if the server didn't have a redirection option, if there was no internet-facing client access server in New York, that's okay. She would be proxied over to that mailbox server. So we're good either way. But depending on the device, again, you'll get a different experience. For example, if you're using ActiveSync for your mobile connections, then AutoDiscover will send you right to the correct CAS when you connect up. So that's the nice thing about AutoDiscover solutions. Anything that involves AutoDiscover would know how to send you to the right place if there was an internet-facing client access server that it could connect to. But another thing to consider is that if you're integrating Exchange 2013 client access with, let's say, Exchange 2010 or 2007, that interoperability with earlier versions or legacy versions of Exchange has some unique concerns and unique issues. For example, the need to have registered legacy namespaces in 2007. Now, it's not within the scope of this lesson to address every single connection type and the way that it operates or interoperates. However, there's a great resource that I mentioned at the end of this lesson in the additional research, and I mentioned chapter 21 of the book Mastering Exchange 2013. The book was written by a variety of different Exchange experts, but The one who wrote Chapter 21, his name is Jeff Rosen. And this is really a fantastic explanation of the client access server role. And the chapter covers all sorts of things that relate to the version of Exchange you're using and the type of connection you're trying to make. So are you using an Outlook web app connection, an ActiveSync connection? What are you trying to access? Is it a mailbox on a server running 2010, a server running 2007? Is it in the same site? Is it in another site? And each scenario is a little bit different in terms of how the client access server will respond, whether or not it proxies or redirects the connection, whether or not the connection requires nothing new to be done, or perhaps requires, as in the case of Exchange 2007, some type of legacy namespace provided. So it's a lot. It's a lot to think about, but this chapter covers it well. I know we talked about load balancing already, but it's just good to mention this again when we're talking about troubleshooting, because load balancers are also another part to the puzzle that can be very complex in terms of how to set these up properly and which ones to choose. Another one is certificates, which we addressed in great detail in a previous lesson. So all of these little pieces to client access can lead to a reason for troubleshooting. But in looking at load balancing again, reasons for using a load balancer might be high availability concerns, concerns about service interruption, whether it's purposeful or not. But let's say you're trying to perform some type of offline maintenance. It's good to know that you can take one of these CAS servers offline, because the load balancer will make sure that the other CAS server or servers are still up and running and will redirect the traffic. You might want to use a load balancer for load balancing logically. That might make sense as far as making sure that you can handle traffic, and so you distribute it across the board there. Load balancers solve all of these different problems, and it takes client connections and manages the traffic back to what they call downstream servers. So this way, the client, it only has to know how to connect to one location, to one namespace. It doesn't need to know that physically there are a variety of resources actually handling all of that processing. But when you look at this, this is where there has been concern over which type of load balancer to go with. And so we talked about in a previous lesson the difference between layer 4 and layer 7 load balancers. And it really comes down to understanding the OSI model, the Open Systems Interconnection model. This model describes the different layers that can be used when it comes to communication in a network. Now, layer 7 is higher up the chain. So in the case of Exchange, a layer 7 load balancer has the ability to look at that data. It has the ability to see the target virtual directories, to know if these services like Outlook Web App or AutoDiscover, if they're up and running. Whereas the layer 4 device really works at the transport layer. So if we think of layer 4, where TCP and UDP reside, that really revolves more around protocols and ports. So we're looking more at the transport layer there, not the application layer. And so with layer 4 load balancers, it has the ability to know the source and target IP addresses and ports, and it can use this information to load balance or to see if the server is up. But it's not able to really dig deeper and try to understand the application layer of things. And so I think we made that clear in the previous lesson on load balancing. But again, it's good to know what you should be doing when it comes to setting up your various load balancers, because server affinity is no longer a concern with Exchange 2013. And so you do have the ability to go with a layer 4 load balancer. It's just good to understand that if you do go with a layer 4 load balancer, you don't necessarily have the same level of control over whether or not the services are actually looked at. Alright, so it's good to just review that kind of information. Again, when it comes to troubleshooting, there are so many different things that can go wrong, will go wrong, and so it's hard to narrow it down to any one subject. So we're kind of shotgunning it here so that you have a full, well-rounded grasp of the subject. So from a scenario perspective, we've reviewed methods for testing client access, like the Remote Connectivity Analyzer. We also reviewed the various services that can access the client access role, and we discussed the difference between proxying and redirection. And then we finished up with a review of load balancing. In terms of additional research that I'd like to recommend, one is the Exchange Remote Connectivity Analyzer tool TechNet articles, and this is a set of articles that will help you to understand what the tool can do in its entirety, not just the Exchange pieces, but it's also good to take a look at the client piece there as well as the Office 365 connectivity piece. And then I'd also like to recommend in the book Mastering Exchange 2013, published by Cybex, Chapter 21, Understanding the Client Access Server. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.